It was a gray, quiet morning at the county courthouse when something unexpected shifted the atmosphere. The courtroom was filling up slowly, lawyers setting up their files, the judge reviewing notes, a few reporters whispering near the back row. Everyone expected the day to follow the usual routine. That changed the moment the courtroom doors opened, and a little girl walked in, holding a leash. She was small, barely 8 years old, wearing a neat dress and holding tightly to the soft red leash attached to a golden retriever with intelligent eyes and a calm posture. The dog walked beside her with quiet dignity, wearing a blue vest that clearly read, "Certified Support Animal." For a moment, the room froze. It wasn't common to see a child on the witness list, let alone one accompanied by a dog. Murmurs filled the room, not with ridicule but curiosity. Some people smiled, while others seemed puzzled. A few looked at the judge, unsure if this was even allowed. But the judge simply nodded, having already approved the request in private chambers. The little girl, Emily, didn't seem to notice the attention. Her eyes were steady, her lips pressed into a focused line. Her hand rested gently on the golden fur of the dog, Max, who moved with quiet assurance. He didn't bark. He didn't sniff around. He simply sat beside her at the witness box, eyes forward, as if he knew this was important. One court officer leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "That dog's got more composure than half the people we see testify." The bailiff called the courtroom to order. Emily and Max took their place. There was something disarming about the scene, something unusually human in a space often filled with tension and formality. The presence of the girl and her dog reminded everyone that behind every case file and testimony was a real person, sometimes very young, carrying a very big burden. The judge glanced down from the bench, not unkindly. "Are you comfortable, Emily?" he asked. She gave a small nod, then glanced down at Max, who blinked slowly and sat a little straighter. No one could have guessed at that moment just how significant the dog's role would be, not just in comforting a scared child, but in changing the entire tone of what was to come. And none of them could have predicted what Max would do next. Emily wasn't like most children her age. She didn't chatter endlessly or run from place to place with bursts of energy. Most days, she preferred silence, not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that felt safe. Her parents had come to understand that words weren't always easy for her, not after everything she had been through. But there was one place where she never struggled to be herself, by Max's side. Max had entered her life 2 years earlier, during a time when Emily had nearly stopped speaking altogether. Doctors and counselors had explained it gently. Her silence was a response to fear, to confusion, to things she couldn't fully understand or explain. Her parents were desperate for something, anything, that might help. That's when they found Max, a therapy dog trained to work with children dealing with emotional trauma. From the moment Max walked into their home, something changed. He didn't demand her attention. He didn't expect her to talk. He simply lay beside her, his steady breathing and warm presence saying more than words ever could. Emily started sleeping through the night again. She began humming, then drawing. Eventually, she whispered to Max before bedtime, and her parents could hear the faintest laugh in the hallway. Over time, Max learned to read her better than anyone else. He knew when she needed space and when she needed closeness. He could sense when her heart started racing. If she was overwhelmed, Max would gently nudge her with his nose or rest his head on her lap. Emily didn't need to ask. He just knew. That connection only deepened in the months leading up to the court date. Emily's therapist noticed it too, how the dog could ground her like nothing else. The legal team had been worried that Emily might not be able to testify at all. But when asked how she felt about going to court, Emily's only question was, "Can Max come too?" That question changed everything. With special permission, Max was allowed to accompany her. It was rare, but the judge understood the importance. What no one expected, though, was how active Max's role would become. Because their connection wasn't just emotional, it was quietly tactical. In their sessions at home, Emily had learned a secret way to talk to Max without speaking. A hand signal, a gesture, a code. And when the moment came, she would use it, not for tricks, not for attention, but for something much more powerful, courage. In the quiet evenings before the trial, the living room had become more than just a place to rest. It became a training ground, not for Max, who had already been through years of therapy dog preparation, but for Emily, who was learning how to be brave in a world that often felt too loud, too confusing, and too big. Her therapist sat with her cross-legged on the floor, gently guiding her through mock questions and simple exercises. The idea wasn't to rehearse her testimony word for word, but to help her feel a sense of control. At the center of it all was Max, lying patiently nearby, his eyes following Emily's every move. "Let's practice the signal again," the therapist said softly, smiling in encouragement. Emily nodded, barely noticeable. She lowered her hand to her side and tapped 2 fingers against her leg. That was the signal, a quiet motion they had worked on for weeks. Max lifted his head, stood and took 2 steps forward, just enough to place his paw gently on her foot. Emily smiled and reached down to scratch behind his ear. "That's perfect," her therapist said. "You don't need to say a word. Max will know what you need." The signal wasn't chosen at random. It had to be something subtle enough to go unnoticed by others, but clear enough for Max to recognize. They chose it together. 2 fingers met, "I need you." It wasn't just a cue. It was a lifeline. Her parents watched from the kitchen doorway, both proud and quietly anxious. They knew their daughter was brave, but they also knew how easily fear could pull her into silence. What comforted them most was knowing that Max would be there, not just in the room, but alert, connected, and ready. As the days counted down to the trial, the family practiced together. Sometimes Emily would give the signal in different rooms, or while answering pretend questions. Max never missed it. His responses were always calm and immediate, like a dance only the 2 of them knew. On the night before the court appearance, Emily whispered to Max as they curled up in her bed, "Just stay with me. That's all I need." He blinked slowly, exhaled through his nose, and rested his head across her legs. The next day would be hard. But thanks to a silent signal and a dog who understood it, Emily wouldn't face it alone. She was ready, not to fight, not to shout, but to speak. And when words failed her, Max would be there to remind her that she was never truly alone. The courtroom was silent as Emily stepped up to the witness stand, Max close at her side. His paws made no sound on the polished floor, but his presence spoke volumes. A few members of the jury exchanged glances. It wasn't every day they saw a child take the stand with a dog beside her, but something about the way Max moved, calm, alert, focused, made it feel natural, almost necessary. Emily climbed onto the padded seat, her small legs dangling a few inches above the floor. Max sat just to her right, his eyes scanning the room, then resting on her. The judge offered her a kind smile before turning to the attorneys. "You may proceed." The prosecutor began gently, asking Emily to confirm her name, her age, and simple details to help her feel grounded. Emily answered softly, her voice just above a whisper. Each time she spoke, Max's ears twitched, as if he was listening too. At first, things went smoothly. The questions were clear and kind. Emily responded with quiet honesty, her gaze occasionally dropping to Max's golden fur. But then it was the defense attorney's turn. He approached the stand with a calm but pointed tone. "Emily," he began, "I know this might be difficult, but I need you to answer clearly. Can you tell the court exactly what you remember from that day?" Emily hesitated. Her fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress. The courtroom, so quiet before, suddenly felt louder. The air was heavy. The man's voice wasn't unkind, but it was firmer, more exacting. He leaned slightly forward. "Take your time, but remember, the truth matters here." Max shifted slightly. Emily took a shaky breath, looking down at her hands. Her eyes darted toward the jury, then to the judge, then back to her lap. The courtroom seemed to be waiting, holding its breath. Her throat tightened. Words stalled. Then her hand moved. Subtle, practiced, and nearly invisible, Emily lowered her right hand beside her leg and tapped her fingers, once, twice, against her thigh. It was the signal, and Max responded. He stood up slowly, deliberately, and placed one paw gently on the wooden edge of the witness stand. His movement was silent but full of meaning. His touch, light as air, landed beside Emily's hand. She didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes for just a moment and exhaled. A quiet hush rippled through the room. No one quite understood what had just happened, but it was clear something important had passed between them. The pressure was still there. The questions would continue. But Emily had just reminded herself, and everyone else, that she wasn't alone on that stand. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as Max's paw landed softly on the edge of the witness stand. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. But it was unlike anything anyone in that room had ever seen. Emily didn't speak right away. She looked down at Max, who held his position like a statue. His paw didn't move. His eyes, calm and unwavering, were focused only on her. It was as if he were telling her, "You're okay. I'm right here. Just keep going." A soft gasp came from someone in the gallery. A member of the jury leaned slightly forward in their seat. The judge blinked, not in disapproval, but in curiosity. Even the defense attorney paused, caught off guard by the silent exchange unfolding before him. Emily reached out and rested her fingers lightly on Max's fur. Her breathing steadied. Her shoulders, which had tensed moments before, relaxed. The tremble in her hand slowed. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for everyone to notice. When she looked up again, her eyes no longer darted around the room. They were steady, focused. "I remember," she said quietly, answering the question the attorney had asked before she'd frozen. The courtroom seemed to exhale with her. She continued, voice soft but clear, answering each question with short but honest replies. The attorney, who had prepared for hesitation or silence, now found himself choosing his words more carefully. He softened his tone, realizing that this was not going to be the testimony he expected. Max, still standing beside her, eventually lowered his paw but remained close. His body formed a small barrier between Emily and the world. She didn't need to touch him constantly. Just knowing he was there made all the difference. The judge, watching from the bench, made no move to interrupt. He didn't need to. Nothing about Max's behavior broke courtroom protocol. In fact, it had done something more powerful than any rulebook could measure. It had allowed a scared little girl to find her voice in a moment that mattered. Reporters in the back took quiet notes. No one dared whisper anymore. Emily had given a signal, a quiet cry for help no one else could see. And her dog had answered, without a single word, with perfect timing, and with more understanding than most adults in the room. The testimony wasn't over yet, but from that moment forward, everyone in the courtroom knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a trial, but trust in its purest form. After Max responded to the signal, something shifted, not just in Emily, but in the entire courtroom. It was subtle at first, a quiet sense of attention, a softening. People leaned in, not to scrutinize, but to listen. They weren't just hearing a child speak. They were witnessing the bond between a little girl and her dog transform fear into courage in real time. Emily sat up straighter now. Her hands no longer clutched the edge of her dress. Her voice, while still small, carried more strength. She was no longer shrinking under the pressure of the moment. She was rising through it. The defense attorney noticed too. His next questions came slower, gentler, as if even he didn't want to interrupt what was happening. He stopped trying to challenge her with tricky phrasing or fast delivery. Instead, he began treating her less like a witness and more like a person. Because somehow, Max had made it impossible to forget that's exactly what she was, a child doing her best in an overwhelming situation. Every time a difficult question was asked, Emily would glance at Max. Sometimes she'd touch his fur. Sometimes she didn't need to. Just knowing he was there seemed to be enough. And every time she struggled, Max adjusted, tilting his head toward her, shifting slightly so she could see him better, even resting his head gently on her foot once, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone. The jury was paying attention too. One juror had tears welling in her eyes. Another sat motionless, eyebrows raised, visibly impressed by the calm confidence Emily had found. The judge remained quiet, letting the moment unfold. He, too, understood something rare was happening. This wasn't a courtroom performance. There was no manipulation, no theatrics, just a child telling the truth, anchored by the quiet loyalty of the one soul in the room who asked for nothing, just to be there for her. By the time the testimony ended, the courtroom felt different, quieter, more human. As Emily stepped down from the witness stand, Max walked beside her, his steps measured, matching hers exactly. They moved together like a team, two parts of one story that could not be told without the other. People would talk about that moment for weeks, even months. Not just what was said, but how it was said, and how a dog named Max changed the course of a trial not by speaking, but simply by being there when he was needed most. When the session paused for a recess, the hallway outside the courtroom filled with quiet conversation. But unlike most trials, there were no loud debates, no arguments over what had just happened. Instead, people spoke in hushed voices, as if afraid to disturb the memory of what they'd just witnessed. Emily and Max had returned to a private waiting room, giving the rest of the court a chance to breathe. Inside, the atmosphere was far from relaxed. It was reverent. A member of the jury quietly asked the bailiff if dogs were allowed in every trial like this. Another juror was seen wiping their eyes with a tissue, whispering, that dog knew exactly what she needed. Even the clerk, who had worked in that courthouse for over 20 years, said she had never seen anything quite like it. In the hallway, the prosecutor and defense attorney exchanged brief, respectful nods. Whatever competitive edge they had brought to the case had softened. No one could ignore what Max had done, because it wasn't just unusual. It was undeniably real. Back in the judge's chambers, the judge sat at his desk, reviewing his notes. He paused mid-sentence, leaned back, and looked out the window. His expression was thoughtful. He'd presided over dozens of trials involving children, many of them tense, heartbreaking, and emotionally draining. But something about this day stood apart. He turned to his assistant and said quietly, "We need to look into how we can make that kind of support more available. This shouldn't be the exception." Meanwhile, Emily's therapist sat with her and Max in the quiet room. Emily looked lighter, like someone who had just walked through a storm and come out standing. She reached down, gently rubbing Max's ear. "He helped me," she said, simply. "You helped you," her therapist replied, smiling. "Max just reminded you what you already had." Reporters outside the courthouse began preparing their notes for the evening news. But this time, it wasn't a headline about conflict or controversy. It was about courage, connection, and the quiet strength of a girl and her dog. The ripple effects of that testimony were already spreading. In legal forums, judges would soon be discussing the role of support animals in courtrooms. In schools, teachers would share Emily's story with students as a lesson in bravery. But at that moment, none of that mattered to Emily. She was tired, but peaceful, and as Max curled up beside her feet, she smiled and whispered, "We did it." Weeks after the trial ended, the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm: case files, legal arguments, motions, and rulings. But for those who had been there that day, nothing felt quite the same. Something had stayed behind, something unspoken. It wasn't about the verdict, though justice had quietly taken its course. It was about the girl with the steady eyes and the golden retriever who helped her find her voice. Emily had gone back to school, back to riding her bike in the driveway, back to afternoons spent drawing quietly at the kitchen table. But everyone around her noticed the difference. She laughed more often. She answered questions with more confidence. Her words no longer felt like a struggle. They came freely, not all the time, but often enough to remind her parents that healing had begun. Max, ever faithful, stayed by her side through it all. He had always been her guardian in the quiet moments, but now he had become something even more, a symbol of strength, of trust, of calm in chaos. One morning, Emily's parents received a letter from the courthouse. Inside was a handwritten note from the judge. It read, "Please thank your daughter for reminding us what bravery looks like, and thank Max for showing us how compassion can speak even in silence. What happened in that courtroom has already changed how we approach future cases involving children. Your family has left a mark here." Her parents read the note twice, eyes misting over. The local newspaper eventually published a piece titled, "A Girl, Her Dog, and the Day a Courtroom Stood Still." It included a photo, taken afterward, with permission, of Emily standing outside the courthouse, Max sitting proudly beside her, both of them looking ahead. The article didn't go into the case details. It didn't need to. The focus was on courage and quiet partnership. In time, other families would request support animals in court. Therapists and legal advocates began working together more closely, inspired by what they saw that day. Judges became more open to new ways of supporting vulnerable witnesses, all because of one girl and her dog. Emily would grow older, of course. Her memories of the courtroom would blur with time. But Max would always be part of her story, not just as a helper, but as a hero in his own quiet way. And for everyone who was there, it wasn't just testimony that stayed with them. It was the moment a silent signal was sent, and answered with something stronger than words could ever be.